Our next speaker is Anna Varga-Jani from Pázmány, Péter Catholic University, Budapest. I'm sorry if I spelled something wrong. This is very difficult language, even harder than Polish. So we'll hit with Anna's talk.
Welcome everybody at the conference to Christian philosophy. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers that they made it possible to hold our lectures online. However, I think it's a very difficult task to hold a lecture without any direct connection with each other. Anyway, the title of my paper sounds From the Husserlian Transcendental Idealism to the Question of Being, an Original Linkage between Phenomenology and Theology in Edith Stein's thinking. In my paper, I will highlight the transition of Edith Stein's thinking from the Husserlian Transcendental Idealism to the phenomenological question on creation, by virtue of the problem of being for the phenomenological thinking. Even though the question on being occupied a central position in the early phenomenological thinking, for Edith Stein it became the key factor in elaborating of the Christian philosophy into the context of the 20th century philosophical thinking. Edith Stein wrote in 1932 in a short paper on knowledge, truth, being, that being cannot be defined because, I quote, it is required by every definition because it is contained in every word and in every sense of word. It is recorded with everything that is recorded and is preserved in the recording itself. One can only state differences of being and of beings, end of quote. This paper is a clear evidence of Stein's gradual turn from the phenomenological position to the scholastic philosophy, and that this application has also required a methodological change in her thinking. The scholastic influence in Edith Stein's thinking reflects on an old expectation of the scholastic view of being, since it would be considered failure for the phenomenological method not to deal with the question of being, but rather exposing the description of the individual things. The totality of these influences shaped her phenomenological concept in the direction of the possibility of a Christian philosophy. The first step within the graduate project, which was finally completed in the Opus Finite and Eternal Being, and in the mystical writings, was the translation of Thomas Aquinas' Questiones Disputate de Veritate. Her introductory first sentence on the translation De Veritate shows that from the outset she has been thinking of the dimension of Philosophia Perennis, and that the translation was inspired in methodological sense by the common problem areas of phenomenology and Thomistic philosophy. The starting point in the methodological question seems her to be the question of truth, which even in different ways occupies the central position in both directions of thought. The main question of Edith Stein is whether we can talk about the same truth here and there, and whether the truth would be phenomenologically understandable from the perspective of the transcendentals in the scholastic philosophy. The second part of the introduction to De Veritate focuses on the mode of cognition that leads to the knowledge of truth in both phenomenology and in Thomas thinking, and proves that phenomenological knowledge consists in the adequatio rei et intellectus, while for Thomas the truth is the one by which knowledge is measured. I quote, "There are many truths, but the truth by which everything is measured, and that is the agreement with the Divine Spirit, is only one. And since the Divine Spirit gives us knowledge of the first principles, this first truth is what we judge everything about. The truth understood as the agreement of the human mind with things, the veritas creata, in contrast with the veritas aeterna, seems as there were many mirror images and therefore many truths. Basically, however, every truth is only true insofar as it corresponds to the one standard that is by agreement with the divine spirit. End of quote. Edelstein found a common point between scholastic thought and phenomenology in the act of knowledge. If Stein characterizes knowledge in the modern philosophy as the view of the essence, as such questions that are central for the modern epistemologist, such as the phenomenological question, what is knowledge according to its nature, then Stein's view is the knowledge in connection with the epistemology of Thomas. When Thomas wrote in the first question about the differentiation within the real world, then Stein sees it as a differentiation of knowledge. I quote, "This differentiation within the real world corresponds to a differentiation of knowledge. There is no general definition of knowledge at all possible. All knowledge is either divine or creature, and none of them can be classified under the same terms." End of quote. According to Stein, the differentiation of knowledge doesn't reveal an epistemological view of the world, but this primacy of knowledge meant the ontological foundation of understanding. If the object of knowledge in both the phenomenological and the scholastical senses is being, then there is another commonality in ontological terms, namely the criterion of truth in the knowledge in both cases. I quote, "Truth, das Wahre, is being in terms of knowledge. The truth, die Wahrheit, is the correspondence of knowledge and being. Knowledge has its measure of things, but of the divine spirit. There are many truths, but the truth by which everything is measured, and what is the agreement with the divine spirit, is only one. And since the divine spirit gives us knowledge of the first principles, this first truth is what we judge everything about." End of quote. In the scholastic sense, the knowledge of the truth of being creates the connection with the divine truth. In the main work, Finite and Eternal Being, this theory of truth establishes the possibility for the common essence of Christian philosophy in the modern sense. This analysis of truth consists in finite and eternal being through the analysis of truth in its temporal definiteness. At the beginning, Edelstein deals with the being as such through the problem of the finite and eternal being, but the aim of the work extends to the question of the possibility of Christian philosophy, which Stein wants to realize as the philosophia perennis of philosophizing. In the center of the investigation is one's own being in its actuality and potentiality, which is phenomenologically determined in temporality. The individual being of the experiencing subject is in relation to the object of experience, an eternal, unchangeable being, what Stein calls pure, and which participates in the act of creation. On the other hand, the pure, in relation to the eternal being of God, has a finite and limited being that plays a time-determined role in the history of creation. In this sense, Edelstein refers to Hedwig Konrad Martius' work, Die Zeit, and describes the temporal definiteness of experience from the timeless existence of the ego. I quote, "This means that the being of which I am conscious as mine is inseparable from temporality. As actual being, that is, as actually present being, it is without a temporal dimension, punctual. It is now in between a no more and a not yet. But by its breaking apart in its flux into being and not being, the idea of pure being is revealed to us. In pure being, there is no longer any admixture of not being, nor any no longer and not yet. In short, pure being is not temporal, but eternal. End of quote. The fifth part of the work, Finite and Eternal Being, gets its special importance by Wittgenstein's distinction between the ways of the phenomenological and theological knowledge according to their different criteria on truth, respectively, that she synthesizes them in the definiteness of the transcendentals. According to Stein's explanation, the question of being and its different forms and genres in beings led us to the meaning of being. After explaining the relationship of finite and eternal beings through the temporal opening of reality, which bears the essential features of truth, Stein proves how the image of the Trinity in creation sheds light on the connection between person and hypostasis, which can be enlightened through the analysis of the history of philosophy. Analogously, in that the person recognizes himself as a person and develops his personality in time, the incarnated Son is developed as the second divine person of the divine hypostasis in the history of creation. I quote, "These concepts were essential not only for an understanding of the three-personality of God, but also for an understanding of the being of people and generally of thing actuality." End of quote. In this sense, the philosophical understanding of creation is at the same time the gradual understanding of the history of salvation in its factual existence of the world experience. According to the final paragraph of the last chapter in the book Finite and Eternal Being, the connection between the final human being and eternal being is constituted by the embodiment of the Son in Logos as the Logos. The whole mystery of Jesus' historical being forms in the original meaning of Genesis that human being as finite being obtains its sense through the participation in eternal creation. The closing words of Wittgenstein to the work Finite and Eternal Being sounds, I quote, "For humankind is the portal through which the Word of God entered into the created world. Human nature has received the Word, and the Word is linked in a special way with human beings, by virtue of the unity of common descent, not with subhuman nature and not with angels. As the head of humankind, which combines in itself the higher and the lower reaches of being, Christ is the head of creation in its totality." End of quote. And now I sum up. The previous analysis resulted in the finding that the existential question of Wittgenstein's religiosity led through phenomenology to the later question of being, which in its final form illuminates the theological questions with natural phenomenology from the perspective of the Christian thinker. The passage to Christian philosophy in the sense of the Philosophia Perennis is reflected in Stein's short essays of the 1930s, where phenomenology is no longer understood as a pure methodological problem, but rather it manifests in the question of whether Christianity is in dialogue with philosophical thinking. In the main work, A Finite and Eternal Being, Wittgenstein completely overcame the previous methodological question by virtue of including the facts of revelation in the phenomenological world experience. From the aspect of the Christian thinker, the question of being was illuminated phenomenologically for the natural thinking. However, the Christian philosophy allows us to grasp its methodological core through the theological tradition in the act of faith. In this sense, Stein's thesis is that the methodology of Christian philosophy is based on the tradition of Christianity, the source of which is the twofold practice of knowledge and faith. Thank you for your attention.
And that was Anna. Thank you, Anna. And now we can move to the questions. Do we have any questions here on site from people in Krakow? Anyone? Now is the time for the questions. Is everything clear on the relation between phenomenology and theology and how one can contribute to the latter? I think they understood everything. You have a question. Okay. So please come here and sit.
Hello to everybody. Thank you for your presentation. Concerning the relationship between phenomenology and theology, do you mean the current direction in philosophy, which is called? Did you hear about some movement in philosophy which is called ontotheology?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course.
And well, I will continue later. So, did you hear about this movement in contemporary philosophy? Did you mean this movement, or you were speaking especially about Husserlian approach? Did you mean specifically this movement in contemporary philosophy, which is called ontotheology?
Do you mean other? This was the question of you? Is your question?
I wanted to know, in your title, as a subject of your presentation, you announced as a part of your topic an original relation between phenomenology and theology. And this can be this can be considered. Your approach, what you were talking about, could be considered within a movement in contemporary philosophy, which is called ontotheology. Or not, or you didn't mean this?
Yeah, yes, but in my lecture I was talking about especially about Edelstein, but I think this what Edelstein wrote and her direction into the Christian philosophy is the first step into the ontology, because in this early Husserlian circle, in this early Göttingen circle around Husserl, was raised at the first time the question about being, how we experience being, how we can phenomenologically talk about being. And this was the first point, or the first step, where Edelstein raised the question whether we can talk about finite being and eternal being, how we can distinguish these two from each other phenomenologically. And yes, ontology. So when we talk about ontology, we especially think on Martin Heidegger, who established this phenomenological streams. And Martin Heidegger was also a student from Edmund Husserl and was influenced by the Husserlian phenomenology, and was in relationship with this Göttingen circle, especially also with Christine, with Roman Garden and so on. And I think this Heideggerian question on being and on phenomenological ontology originates also from the Husserlian phenomenology. And when we see this temporal philosophical stream, this temporal phenomenological or ontotheological stream, especially at Jean-Luc Marion, we also find a special influence by Martin Heidegger and by the Husserlian phenomenology as well, and Paul Ricoeur. So I think to answer on your question, I think there is a direct connection with this early phenomenological circle and with this present phenomenological movement. Yes.
Because listening to your presentation, I thought that what you were talking about is a beginning of this link between phenomenology and theology in Husserl may be interesting in the context of this new movement in contemporary philosophy, and which is called ontotheology, and especially it would be interesting to see how contemporary philosophers it is a mutual, it is a reciprocal interaction between theology concerning the questions usually treated within phenomenological philosophy, and reciprocally it would be interesting to see how philosophers try to approach questions which were relevant traditionally in theology. So, and what you were talking about, it is at the beginning of this movement.
Yes, of course. So at Jean-Luc Marion, I didn't find any direct connection with Edith Stein or with Roman Garden or with Hedwig Martius either, but the topics of his philosophical approaches are very similar to this Husserlian circles topics, especially to Edith Stein. So for example, Jean-Luc Marion also looks for connections with the scholastic philosophy and takes examples from the scholastic philosophy and the question on being, and yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I can see one question on the stream. If no one has a question here, I will ask the question. I will read the question, and Anna, please answer to this. And the question is whether this idea of phenomenological contribution to theology applies only to the Husserlian phenomenology or also to the contemporary phenomenologists. I think you mentioned this in the discussion with Evelina, but please, would you please respond to this? Mention some other contemporary philosophers, phenomenologists. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as I answered previously, so I can mention Jean-Luc Marion, of course, but this stream or this stream originates, I think, from the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur, who also connected to the Husserlian phenomenology and step by step moved to the theological hermeneutic and tried to explain the history of theology, and or especially only just the history phenomenologically. And so I think there is a direct connection between this early phenomenological movement and the present. And I can also mention Emmanuel Falk, who is also very keen on this topic to explain the history of theology or theological events phenomenologically. But of course, there are very different topics also in this philosophical area.